Check, check. Check, check. Check, check. Check, check, check. Mic 1. That should be good. Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Here, let me turn this down. Good morning. Still seems a little loud. Is that better? Donde está the live chat? Is there no live chat? Enable auto start. Does not support. Huh. Well, I don't know where the live chat is, but I can see that there's 4 people in here. Maybe I just have to refresh it or something. Where the heck is it? Well, it doesn't much matter, I suppose, but good morning to you all. Will you get down, troublemaker? I'm just going to copy this stream over to Schoology really quick. There it is. There's the live chat. Let's see if I can type. Does that work? Are you guys able to hear me okay? Okay, cool. Just making sure. All right, well, today we're going to be talking about the French Revolution, and I'm going to copy this link over and put it into the updates section on each period of Schoology so that people can click on the link there. Appreciate your flexibility on Monday. I know that a lot of teachers aren't even doing live lectures. I think probably I'm going above and beyond what really I'm been asked to do, but I just feel like this is the best way of relaying information is to do a live lecture and try to have some degree of interaction. Some teachers are doing Zoom meetings. They're fine. I just think that YouTube is more reliable. Plus, you can go back and watch it later. You don't have to be in the actual meeting, which I feel like helps people with scheduling and so on. Today's live lecture link. Okay. And then we'll select that. And then we got to go over to period 2. Mochi, what are you doing? Little rascal. Mochi. Mochi, you're so cute. How come you're so cute? Do 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 do. I look so different? Oh, wait, that was from a comment from before. Let's see here. Oh, I looked so different in the old video. Yeah, I know. That's what it was talking about. We'll go to period 4. And then we click updates. We'll do that. Post. All right. Very good. So that took a little bit, but we got it to work. I don't know why, but sometimes, like, I feel like because everybody's at home, the internet doesn't run as fast as it used to. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but normally my internet would be so quick. And nowadays, ever since this whole COVID thing, I feel like it's half the speed that it usually is. Good morning, Christine. Good to have you in here. I can't really see you, so can't say good to see you, but good to have you. So let's go ahead and start reviewing the French Revolution. So I'm going to use the same PowerPoint that I did back when we were covering the French Revolution. Let me put that, let's see here, files and links. And then we go to previous PowerPoints as usual. And then we just have to click on the French Revolution one, which should be this one right here. Click that. And download. As soon as it decides to load, there it goes. All right. So, excuse me. French Revolution. Let's talk. Monday's lesson was about 18th century Europe, social changes and so on. And in the 18th century, the 1700s, Europe is still largely absolutist in nature. Politically, Europe is run by mostly an aristocratic group of nobles and monarchs. And depending on where you're at in Europe, the further west that you go, the monarch's power is more centralized. The further east that you go, the monarch's power is still absolute, but less absolute perhaps than in Western Europe. Because in places like Russia, or before it gets partitioned, Poland, and so on, you have other factors, or even Austria, other factors in play there, like geography and where nobles, how far away nobles are from the central monarch, the Tsar in Russia, or the multi-ethnic problems that they have in the Habsburg Empire. These are the sorts of things that that monarchs have to contend with in terms of challenges to their power in Eastern Europe that may not be quite as present in, say, France. As time goes on throughout the 1700s, you also see this burgeoning, which means growing, intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment, which we did a review on last week. And the Enlightenment was about trying to make sense of the natural state of man, we'll say, in the context or framework of government or economics or social relations or what. So is the natural state of man freedom, right? So, and what does freedom mean? And so when we think about like the Enlightenment, freedom or liberty is a big part of that, but then also to justice, right? Like how should justice be administered? And Europeans, as the time goes on throughout the 1700s, increasingly start to question, as they already had been, this challenge of authority. They'd been questioning the patriarchal systems in place that structured all of society for 1,000 years or more, going back to the Roman Empire. So, like, for example, the patriarchal system of the church. Increasingly, the church is being questioned at this time as a structure that may serve more of an obstacle to progress than assist in human progress. Because the church as a system, as an infrastructure, had a decidedly, anti-scientific stance. The closer we get to, the French Revolution and then the era afterwards in the 1800s. The French Revolution is the first time that we see kind of the complete, I don't want to say complete because it's not complete per se, but like it really, there's a few different things you can say about the French Revolution. The French Revolution is revolutionary in the sense that it challenges the patriarchal system of not just the church, but also absolutism as a whole, and advocates for the bourgeois class, the upper middle class of the Third Estate, which were not nobles, but nonetheless could have still been relatively wealthy merchants or bankers or lawyers or whatnot, bookkeepers. And it gives them access to political power in a way that had not been seen before. So this is revolutionary. But you could also make the argument that to what extent was the French Revolution really revolutionary? That would be a really good DBQ prompt, actually. To what extent was it actually revolutionary? Because if you really look at it, the nobility's power had been chipped away by an absolute monarch for a long time. And while they're still privileged in society, we're seeing changes in European society by that point in the agricultural revolution and so on, as well as in global trade, that have enabled the bourgeois class to accrue quite a bit of wealth, to the point where some of the bourgeois class, the bourgeoisie, was actually wealthier than the nobles were. So was it really revolutionary if these folks were already pushing into this upper echelon of a newly understood society, where today, across the globe, we don't think of nobles as being powerful? Particularly in the United States, we have from the very beginning, we have a decided rejection of the idea of nobles holding power based purely on birthright. And instead, we tend to advocate for more of a meritocratic system, meaning that people are put into positions not because of some sort of special position or relationship that they have, say, to a president or something like that, or not just because they were born of a certain social class, but instead that they got that position because of merit, because of some sort of personal characteristics that they have, or education, or ability, or leadership quality, or whatever it is, that these people are put into positions based on merit, based on their ability to actually perform well in those positions. That's what we've advocated for in the United States for a long time now. Not to say that it doesn't sometimes go the other direction. We see favoritism and nepotism, which is putting people into positions of power just based on the fact that you have you're related to somebody in power or whatever. That sort of thing does still happen, of course, but less widespread these days than it used to be in the olden days, which is like, it didn't matter how qualified you were. If you were the son of the Duke, you were going to be the Duke one day. And that's just how that went. The French Revolution may not have been quite as revolutionary in that sense, because when we look at who really makes up government afterwards, yes, we do see some new people enter into the governmental scheme from the Third Estate, but they're people from the very, very top of the Third Estate who had already for a while been challenging the position of the nobles in France. Now, guys like Voltaire and the other philosophers, Montesquieu and so on, had been hypercritical of the system of French government for a while. And certainly this plays a factor into why the French Revolution breaks out. But you have to ask yourself the question, if the French Revolution would have broken out at all, were it not for the fact that there were some really, really, really perfect ingredients for a storm. Namely, one of the perfect ingredients that went into the French Revolution. So right now we're talking about causes of the French Revolution. One of the perfect ingredients that goes into it is the fact that you had Louis XVI as king of France at this time. Louis XVI had come into power after years of rule by Louis XV, who was a long-lasting king. He wasn't quite as long as Louis XIV, but he still reigns for a long time. And increasingly, Louis XV, towards the end of his reign, tries to kind of put the cats back in the bag. Louis XV, who was the grandfather of Louis XVI, okay, so it's not a father-son relationship, but Louis XV of France, who reigns from 1713, when I actually don't even have the PowerPoint. I'm just talking right now, so hopefully that you guys are following along and so on. By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the box there, and I can hopefully answer them. But yeah, I'm just talking right now. I don't even have the PowerPoint pulled up. I'm just talking to you guys. But Louis XV had reigned from 1713, the death of, or 1714, the death of Louis the 14th. Okay, right at the end of the Spanish Succession War is when Louis XV comes to power. And in the early days of his reign, Louis XV is much more interested in the business of partying and hanging out with Madame Pompadour and stuff like that than he is in governance. And as time goes on, he realizes that nobility, the power of the king has been, like I said, increasingly checked during this time by nobles who were trying to, gain a little bit of an edge in the absolutist system that had been set up by Louis XIV. And as such, we see a situation develop in France where the king doesn't quite have the same level of absolutist prestige that perhaps that Louis XIV did in an earlier generation. As time goes on, Louis XV tries to rein that in and become a little bit more authoritarian in his rule, and it's not super successful. So he gets a little bit more tyrannical towards the end of his reign in order to try to establish some degree of monarchical control again, and that's because he sees some concerning things happening. So as the century has progressed throughout the 1700s, there were issues brewing underneath the surface in France that led to Louis XVI having some real obstacles to his reign. So when we talk about at the end of Louis XV's reign, he had essentially kind of neutered the Parliament of Paris. And this was the major noble aristocratic body that was able to kind of challenge the king's authority. And so Louis XV had tried to undo this. Well, when Louis XVI takes over, he fires René Maupeou and puts into place the Parliament of Paris again. And he does this as a way of trying to gain nobles' favors. The favor of the nobility, which he believed if you have the favor of the nobility, they will be on your side or whatever. But if you just take a simple lesson out of the Book of the Prince by Machiavelli, probably he would have stood to learn a few lessons from Machiavelli to say that, by trying to be friends with the nobles, they're not going to respect you. And so Louis XVI, really from the very get-go of his reign after Louis XV dies, Louis XV's reign is going to be characterized by challenges to his monarchical authority by reestablishing the Parliament of Paris. And so that's one problem, is that you have major leadership problems in France. Okay. Also, Louis XVI comes to rule when he's pretty young. And so he had gotten married to an Austrian princess, Marie Antoinette, who you probably remember. Marie Antoinette was Austrian Habsburg, and the French and the Habsburgs for a long time haven't gotten along with one another. And so this is yet another thing that doesn't sit well with the French people, because he's married to an Austrian princess, a Habsburg. People don't trust her. They don't like her just by pure fact that she's not French. Also, you have a spending problem in France at this time. So France, it has by the time that Louis XVI comes to reign, France has already lost the 7 Years' War. And this is really what caused Louis XV to start to get more serious at the end of his reign, was this war. Because when the French lost this war, they lost colonial assets, not only in North America, which was the biggest aspect of the 7 Years' War from 1754 to 1763, but they also lost territories globally elsewhere, in India and so on. This is going to be a major problem economically for France as well, because the thing with France at this time is that they have a major upside down economic system, where the vast majority of the revenue, or the money that they collect for the state via taxation, is collected from the peasants, from the third estate. So up to 50 to even more percent at certain times in history of the peasants' income is taxed at just ruinously high levels. Okay, so when you're putting that much weight, now of course the French population of peasants makes up about 80% of the total population of France. So you do have a whole lot of people, and that's a big factor in this, because when you have France, which at the time was one of the most populous states, if not the most populous state in all of Europe, 80% of their population is taxed at a rate of 50%. You can go quite a long time sustaining governmental services when you're taxing 80% of your population at 50%. Okay, what do I mean by that? 50%. I'm saying that 80% of the people in France are taxed at 50% of their income. In other words, for every dollar that they earn, 50 cents of that goes to the state. Okay, that's a lot of money, and you can sustain the government for quite a while that way. However, ultimately, you're going to get to a point where at some point you're going to need to tax people who make a whole lot of money. And France was in the system of governance that it had, they were not taxing the nobles because the nobles don't get taxed, and that went on for a long time. Also, any bourgeois members who were really wealthy, in fact, like I mentioned earlier, some of the bourgeois class was wealthier than the nobles were. If you have any money accrued, what you can do then is buy your way into nobility, buy a noble noble of the robe position. I don't know why that was so difficult for me to get out, but anyhow, if you become a noble of the robe, you're a noble just like anyone else, and then you don't have to pay taxes. Well, they had been doing this for a century now, for over a century actually, selling noble of the robe positions, going all the way back to Louis XIV's reign. When you have generationally, generation after generation after generation after generation of people who don't pay taxes, it's not just like a single year where nobles don't get paid. We're talking about 100 years of lost revenue or more of the wealthiest segment of the French population. This is a very upside down taxation system that puts undue pressure on the peasant population, which factors into the next major perfect ingredient that goes into the French Revolution starting, and that is that they had a downturn in the weather. Remember, because 80% of the population is peasants, and France at this time were in the French Revolution, when it first starts in 1789, you're talking about an agrarian population. This is a pre-industrial era. Now, the agricultural revolution has taken place in places in Europe at this time, to varying degrees. Russia less so, but in France and in Britain, you see really a lot of the benefits of the agricultural revolution are really coming into focus now. But when there's a weather turn, and you have 80% of your population who is doing, in France at least, subsistence-style agriculture. And maybe not all of them are doing subsistence-style agriculture, but there's a lot of folks who are still living on subsistence means in France. And what that means is that when the weather turns, and then all of a sudden they can't grow wheat to make bread, which is the staple of the French diet, you're going to have a hunger crisis on your hands. And a hunger crisis is only complicated by the fact that economically, if there's a shortage of wheat, the price of wheat goes up. But there's no room in the budget of the French peasants for prices to go up. They're already taxed at a ruinous rate. So if you see basic survival goods prices go up, what that is going to mean is that they're not going to be able to buy bread just to be able to feed themselves. So this bread shortage really puts a lot of pressure on the peasant population in France. Now, when we talk about the French Revolution, it is important to remember this is not a peasant-led revolt. But it's not a peasant-led revolt. In fact, you could even argue that the true cause of the French Revolution happens because the nobles, of all people, are the ones who refuse to change. The nobles in France are called together in that Assembly of Notables by Louis XVI, and he's hoping, because he did them a solid and reinstated the Parliament of Paris early in his reign, that they'll now scratch his back and say, look, we need to accept some taxes so that we don't have a major problem on our hands. And they absolutely refuse. They insist that he calls the Estates General together. So the Estates General gets together not because the peasants force it, not even because the bourgeois class forces it. No, it's because the noble class forces the French Revolution to start. And the French Revolution, you could argue, would not have started unless that Estates General meeting had been called. And then, of course, Louis XVI says, oh, yeah, by the way, we're going to go by the old medieval rules instead of giving every delegate who shows up to the Estates General meeting a vote. And it's only when that happens, and then you start to see speeches inspired by the Enlightenment, speeches even in some cases from the First Estate clergy member, not Jean-Baptiste Colbert, what's his name? This is the first time that I've forgotten somebody's name. I've been on such a roll to this point. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. That's who I was trying to think of. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès is a clergy member. He's part of the First Estate, but he comes to the Third Estate meeting and he says this speech. He gives this speech, who is the Third Estate? And the Third Estate is France, is what he says. And so, like, the Third Estate, this is when they kind of throw off the ancient titles, the ancient regime titles of First, Second, Third Estate. They throw off the Third Estate title and they start calling themselves the National Assembly. And they declare that they're going to start making laws on behalf of the French people. But would that have happened at all were it not for the fact that the nobles were so stalwartly opposed to change in government? I would argue probably not. If they would have, keep in mind that a lot of those the Enlightenment thinkers thought that change would come from the top down. They wanted an enlightened monarch, of which we can be clear Louis XVI was not an enlightened monarch. Okay, they wanted an enlightened monarch to make changes from the top down. To be clear, most of them didn't want Republican-style government. For them, that would have been far too radical. Okay, Republican-style government, there's one place on the planet that has it by the time that the French Revolution comes to pass, and that is America. There's not a single place in Europe that's run like a true Republican-style government, not even the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic's the closest thing that they have, but it's still not as truly Republican as America was at that time, which even then you have to question the degree to which that was really a democratic system, because, women couldn't vote, slaves couldn't vote, people who didn't have enough property couldn't vote. So, it's not really even a truly inclusive democracy, even in America at that time. So it'd be hardly recognizable probably to what most of you guys recognize as a democratic Republican system today. But the point being that in France, that's really not what they're advocating for at all. They just simply want certain securities of society and a restructuring of society that embraces the ideals of the Enlightenment. And remember, too, those same kinds of themes of patriarchy and stuff still run very strong through the Enlightenment itself. They are questioning certain patriarchal systems, but they are still patriarchal themselves in the sense that the extent to which women were allowed to participate in the Enlightenment is certainly debatable. The extent to which peasants could have participated in the Enlightenment was certainly debatable. And so these are the sorts of things that we have to be considering as we talk about the French Revolution and how it gets started in the first place. Other factors that led to the start of the French Revolution. The American Revolution is one of them. So basically, the United States sends a few delegates over to Paris during the American French Revolution. The American Revolutionary War, and France, Louis XVI, gets pressured. Mostly just to try to stick it to the British and try and kind of like twist the knife a little bit to the British. They get involved in this war from which they are going to gain absolutely nothing. I mean, really, quite truly, the American Revolution bankrupts France. Okay, it really does. They were already struggling after the 7 Years' War. The American Revolution, even though they end up victorious at the end of it, they don't really gain anything from it. Sure, they have an alliance or a friend in America, I guess, to a degree, but even America is skeptical about France after the war ends, because the French, they know that they don't get anything. The only thing that they get out of this is that Britain loses the North American colonies that the French had, been fighting on back in the 7 Years' War, and to them, that's like a victory. If the British are losing, it's a victory for the French, even if they don't even gain anything from it. So that's another major factor for it. Another major factor is that you have what was the thing that I was going to say just a moment ago? Oh, you have a spending problem. So Versailles. Okay, Versailles was extraordinarily expensive to operate, and it took up a huge amount of royal revenue to make that thing run, and or just operate on a day-to-day basis with the number of folks that were living there and the services and so on. And Versailles is like just a money pit, okay? And they are doing all of these kinds of like court ritual stuff at Versailles that's just insanely expensive. And then Marie Antoinette will like buy exotic plants, trees, import expensive things, ivory and other stuff like that from their colonial possessions. Okay, costs a fortune. They're putting on these parties there at Versailles, costs a fortune, all the finest clothing, all the finest food. The French population loses respect for the king because of the fact that you have this, like, they may as well be living on the moon. They don't have any sense of the real hurt that the population is experiencing at this time, because even though they're only 12 or 13 miles away from Paris at Versailles, they're so far removed from the experience of anyone who's outside of the court festivities. They have no appreciation for it whatsoever. And that's the famous story about Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake." It's the famous line she never said. And the reason she never said it is because, unfortunately, it's almost like you wish she would have said it. because at least then she would have been acknowledging that the peasants even existed in the first place. But unfortunately, the fact that she never said it comes from probably the notion that she never even gave enough of a thought about the peasants in the first place to have even uttered anything about them. And that again goes to show you just how not absent-minded, but just how disconnected the king and the queen were. On the day that the storming of the Bastille happens, what is that? July 14th, I think. July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille. Okay, the storming of the Bastille, on that day, if you remember in class, I told you that Louis XVI goes hunting. He comes back after spending the day hunting in the gardens at Versailles, and writes in his journal nothing, referring not to the fact that nothing happened that day, but the fact that he spent the whole day hunting and didn't get anything. Meanwhile, you have now a full-blown revolution in France going on where people are freaking out. Okay, they are freaking out. They're cutting people's heads off. They're tearing down the Bastille brick by brick. Okay, it is chaos in Paris, 13 miles away. And this guy writes nothing in his journal. And if that doesn't say something about the position of the nobility in France at this time, comparative to the rest of society, I don't know what does. Let me take a look here and see if there's any comments. Nope. We still have 7 people watching. That's nice. I think that's right. Is that right? Maybe I'll refresh this just to make sure. It says I'm still streaming. That'd be really sad if I was sitting here talking to no one. Is it still working? I can't tell if it's still... You guys still here? I feel like such a boomer right now. All right, kid, get this internet. Okay, good. Just making sure. Okay, so continuing on. French Revolution. So let's just talk a little bit about, in kind of a more specific sense, what happens with the French Revolution and how the whole thing gets underway, right? So it starts off with... you have some problems brewing in the 1780s in France, okay? You had that miniature ice age. We've talked about all the causes now. Let's talk about how the actual thing unfolds. So it starts off, essentially, things... so there's a guy called Jacques Necker. I'll put his thing here. Jacques Necker. And Jacques Necker is a finance minister that Louis XIV hires, and he's highly liked and respected by the Third Estate because he's kind of got this progressive idea about how he can fix some of the economic problems in France, and he's trying to get the noble class to listen to his ideas and implement some changes so that they can prevent chaos from breaking loose, basically. And Jacques Necker ends up getting dismissed, and this doesn't go over well with the Third Estate or the peasants because he was kind of seen as like one of the guys who was potentially, he was an enlightened kind of guy, and he was a student of the Enlightenment, and he's forward thinking, and they're thinking like Jacques Necker might have play a particular important role in changing the direction of the economic situation in France, but he gets fired. And at that time, Louis XVI says, well, look, we got some problems going on right now. Let's call together this assembly of notables. So he calls together this assembly of notables to try to get the nobility to agree to be taxed, to fund issues. And the nobles absolutely refuse to be taxed. And so when the Assembly of Notables comes to a close, basically the only thing that comes out of that is that the nobles insist that if they want a change to things, that change will have to be voted on in the medieval parliamentary, like national parliamentary meeting called the Estates General, where you gathered representatives from each of the estates: first estate, second estate, third estate. First estate clergy, second estate nobility, third estate everybody else, including the bourgeoisie, and you get delegates from each of those estates. You bring them in, you have them vote. But if you remember the Estates General system, the way that the voting worked is that each estate got one vote. So first estate gets one vote, second estate gets one vote, third estate gets one vote, and that's a bad system, because that means that no matter what, the two privileged classes are always going to be able to outvote the third estate. So if they had voted based on the number of delegates that showed up, the third estate, of course, represented 97% of the population. They had twice as many delegates as the other two estates did, and so they would have had an advantage in that scenario. And that would have allowed potentially for some changes to be made to the taxation system in France. But Louis XVI, in his infinite wisdom, that's a sarcastic statement, decides, no, we're not going to do things a new way. We're going to do it the old way. Now, remember, this is the first time that the Estates General meeting had been called in 175 years. So nobody in the Estates General meeting remembers the last time it went, how it went the last time or anything like that. It happened long before any of them were born. And so this Estates General meeting gets to start, and they don't meet together. Each of the estates meets separately. But as I mentioned earlier, as time goes on, increasingly the third estate becomes more and more and more critical of the process, and of the fact that you have this group of people who are incredibly intelligent and talented, and in some cases even wealthy, but also who is unfairly, due to this lack of a meritorious system in France, who are kept out of any sphere of political influence. So keep in mind the rigidity between the classes in France at this time said that if you let's say that you were from the third estate, let's say you were from the third estate and you're a bourgeois wealthy member of the third estate, and you say, you know what, I may not be a real noble, but I'm just going to buy some noble clothes and dress up and pretend to be a noble. That was punishable by death. Okay, it's an insanely rigid social structure. There's very little mobility between the classes unless you purchase a noble of the robe position, it would cost a generation's worth of wealth. So it was not a fair system, because you had people who were really, really talented, really, really educated, really, really, really smart people who were not able to serve in capacities in government unless, let's say, you were like magically appointed into a position by the king or something like that. But it was a rare scenario. And so, as like an intendant, for example. But just generally speaking, there's no like voting process. There's no way that a person could just like, I'm going to run for mayor of whatever and then hopefully be elected or something. Like, there's nothing like that can happen at that time. So the third estate starts to become more feisty. Like I said, they start making speeches for their love of liberty. And at the third estate, everybody was instructed to create a list of grievances. And this was called the Cahier des Doléances, which I'm butchering how you pronounce that, because I don't speak French. But this Cahier des Doléances was a list of complaints, essentially, of things that needed to be fixed. And basically every estate had to come up with their own list of grievances. And then they would go between these three lists and find the commonalities of them, and that would be what they would vote on in the third estate. Well, of course, the way that the voting works is going to result in in the Estates General meeting is where they would vote on it. But the Estates General meeting, the way that it's set up is that the third estate is going to be outvoted on those. And they know this. The handwriting is on the wall. after Louis XVI makes his decision to run by the old medieval rules. This is when we start to see things like the tennis court oath, where they get locked out of the Estates General meeting by the other two estates. They meet in a nearby tennis court, which was actually a handball court, and then they start making their speeches. This is the beginning of the revolution, and then shortly thereafter we see the storming of the Bastille, which was this very visible dungeon, castle-looking building, medieval dungeon that was situated right in the middle of Paris. And it was a reminder to everybody of the Third Estate. It was very much a symbol of the ancient regime. And now that they have thrown off the title of Third Estate, the National Assembly starts to call for reform and say that they are the ones that are able to make laws on behalf of the French people. And so as time goes on, what's going on here? As time goes on, we see the kind of chaos from France spread to the countryside in what was known as the Great Fear. At that time, because the Third Estate titles has been thrown off, peasants in the countryside start to pick up tools and other instruments, torches, pitchforks, and start to overrun their local manor houses of the nobles' lands that they live on. Because remember, most peasants don't own their own land. They're tenant farmers, so they live on other people's land. And then they pay the landlord just the same way that we think about tenant and landlord relationships today in, like, say, an apartment complex or something like that. Okay, you don't own the apartment. You live in the apartment. You pay somebody to live in it, which is really funny because they don't even do that in Europe anymore, but we still do it here, despite the fact that in Europe, they're the ones who were known for having nobles, and we reject noble relationships. It's kind of weird. Anyway, we still in if you were to go and live in an apartment, that would be your apartment in say like the Netherlands or something like that. If I talked to some Dutch folks when I was in Italy a couple years ago, and I was talking to them, I was like, "How much does rent cost?" And they're like, "What do you mean rent? What is rent?" And I was like when you live in an apartment, like, how much do you have to pay your landlord? And they're like, "You don't pay a landlord, it's yours. You buy it." And it's which is different, very different from what we have here. So it's kind of an interesting fact for you for modern day history. But anyway, so peasants, they start burning down manor houses and ripping up, feudal contracts and things like that. That happens in August of 1789. So all of these changes mean that we're going to see kind of a revolutionary process take place, where things start off kind of conservative and then they make their way to become more radical and then they swing back conservative again. And if you remember and tuned into me talking about the English Civil War last week or a couple weeks ago, it follows a very similar pattern. So it starts off relatively conservative. So the National Assembly isn't trying to establish a republic. To be honest with you, they're just trying to establish a constitutional monarchy like Britain has, which is pretty conservative. Some people are more on board with that idea than others. Some people are more royalist or loyalist, as they're called, meaning that they are loyal to the king and they want to see an absolutist system stay in place. And then other people are more pro-constitutional and more radical. And pretty much the most radical segment of the population at this time is going to come from a certain segment of the bourgeois class. And but at this point, they're kind of a fringe segment of the population. The vast majority of people in France in the National Assemblies want to establish a constitutional monarchy that guarantees the rights of citizens. And so this is where we see, like, for example, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen get drafted. The whole point of the National Assembly was that it was always meant to be a temporary government that drafted a constitutional monarchical style government that forced, it would have kept Louis XVI in power, but would have limited his ability to rule. Almost like a Magna Carta sort of document, or like an English Bill of Rights sort of document. That's the sort of thing that they're trying to get passed in France under the leadership of the National Assembly. Now, of course, when the storming of the Bastille happens, nobles freak out in Paris because they're really concerned about their position, like, in society, but they're probably also worried about the position of their head being secured to their shoulders as well, because who knows what could happen with a riotous and angry mob. Now, we're not yet in the Reign of Terror days, but we're not far from them. During this time, Louis XVI he ends up being forced to sign a constitutional monarchy into place, and this brand new legislative system becomes known as the Legislative Assembly. So remember that one of the tricky parts about the revolution in France, as compared to, say, the revolution in America, is that here in America we go through two very simple iterations of government. We start off after the end of the American Revolutionary War with the Articles of Confederation, and then the Articles of Confederation last for about 6 or 7 years before it becomes grossly apparent to the Americans that it's going to cause more problems than it resolves. And so that's when they kind of scrap the whole thing. And by 1787, they're drafting the Constitution at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention. By 1789, it's ratified and put into place. So we really only have two forms of government here. The Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And the Constitution that we have has been in place now for over 200 years. In France, it doesn't go quite so easy. So they start off with the National Assembly, but then the National Assembly, when its work is complete, it drafts the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, but it also drafts the new Constitution, which establishes the new form of government and dissolves the National Assembly. So the National Assembly is dissolved, there is a new election held, and this is where we see the Legislative Assembly. So the Legislative Assembly lasts from 1790, basically 1791 until 1792. It lasts for 1 year, September of 1791 to September of 1792, or thereabouts. The Legislative Assembly, here's the thing with the problem in France, is that the issue with the bread, the issue with people's discontent about the economic situation in France is not magically going to be resolved by the Declaration of Rights of Citizen or the tearing down of the Bastille or even the signing of the constitutional monarchy into place in France. These problems still exist. And then too, you also have now a problem of a war going on. Because the minute that the ancient regime is overthrown in France and people can start to smell the smoke of the fire that's taking place in Paris, and I don't mean that literally, I'm talking figuratively, okay? As soon as Britain or Austria or Prussia gets a whiff of the issues going on in France, they get rightly concerned, okay? And they mount a force, a coalition force of a bunch of different, national militaries to come and threaten France. So France is now fighting a war against the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns over in Prussia, and then the British. And so, as a result of this, it only complicates the situation. And so now you have even more problems in some sense than you did before, because you have people who are threatening to invade, and so like the Duke of Brunswick, the Brunswick Manifesto was a part of this, where they threatened to, if a hair on the head of any noble was harmed, then Paris would burn. Okay, people are freaking out. By the time that we get to July, August, September of 1792, people are really freaking out then. And this is where we see the September massacres. So rumors start spreading around France that the nobles, which had been kept in a prison, were going to former members of the first and second estate would somehow escape, throw away the Constitution, overthrow the Legislative Assembly, and reestablish absolutist rule under Louis XVI. The extent to which that they would have been able to do this is obviously very questionable. After all, they were in jail. Okay, but the idea starts spreading around and it gains traction, because if the Prussians or Austrians did invade, perhaps the nobles in that scenario would be able to be released from prison if the French couldn't defend themselves or something. So these rumors gain traction, and this is where we see the slaughtering of hundreds to thousands of, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of nobles in France in the September massacres. And the chaos breaking out in France at this time opens the door for the more radical Republicans to say, this isn't working, and we need to establish control in Paris again. And so the powers that be, guys like Robespierre and Georges Danton, who are some of the more radical Republican members of the Third Estate, or the bourgeois class. Remember that Maximilian Robespierre is a lawyer, okay, and statesman, and so he knows this stuff well. And he uses this opportunity of chaos to say, we're going to dissolve the Constitution that had literally just been signed a year earlier. We're going to suspend it in the name of security and safety, dissolve that legislative assembly, and elect a new government that will be able to handle the problems that France is facing at this time. And this is where we see the establishment of now the third in 3 years, new government in France, and that is going to be the National Convention. So we start with the National Assembly, this moves on to the Legislative Assembly, and now we have the Legislative Assembly dissolve and be reestablished under a new system of government, which is going to be the most radical phase of the French Revolution, Republican-style government, although it really does turn into nothing more than just group, almost, it's kind of very similar to the Cromwell years under the Commonwealth of England, which was allegedly Republican-style government. But again, it's like military despotism almost, in a sense. You've got like Oliver Cromwell was a military leader. Now, Robespierre's not a military leader, but the kind of rule that's taking place during the Reign of Terror is going to be despotic in nature. It's very... its power is held by a very small group of people called the Committee of Public Safety after a time. Robespierre, who was once against the death penalty, who was once known as the Incorruptible, is now going to be wielding the death penalty in the name of security. This is the part of the French Revolution where we see, for example, secret police force used in France for people to spy on their neighbors. We see tribunals being held by the government where people are tried in the morning time without even any evidence, and then by afternoon they get executed at the height of the terror. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people at the height of the French Revolution being executed by way of guillotine every single day. The terror was used to implement control. The extent to which that works, of course, is very debatable, but people are very, very fearful that perhaps they could be accused of just not even being excited enough about the French Revolution, and then see their heads separated from their shoulders. Also during this time, it opens the door for other folks like Jean-Paul Marat. Jean-Paul Marat was kind of a professional, almost like a modern day, like, who would he be like the equivalent of? Almost like a modern day, what's that dummy's name? Alex Jones. Okay, not quite that out there. Okay, he wasn't that out there, but like a guy like who has some degree of like, he's like angry, and his whole shtick is that he's angry and, you know, pro really, really radical beliefs and stuff like that. He's kind of like he's like an French Revolutionary version of Alex Jones, if you know who Alex Jones is. He's like a shock jock sort of a guy. He's like a radio. I think he got fired. I'm not really sure what happened to him. He hasn't been around much lately, but for a while he was like he just would put out these insane ideas like aliens. I don't know. I really have no idea. I don't really listen to him, but the point being though that like Jean-Paul Marat has this paper called The People's Friend, which is somewhat of an ironic choice for a title because in The People's Friend he would call out people as being against the revolution, whether he had evidence for it or not. And this is going to be something that results in a lot of innocent people losing their lives, including the brother of one Charlotte Corday, who went into the chamber, the bathroom chamber that Jean-Paul Marat spent most of his time in because he had a skin disease that required him to soak in a saltwater bath or whatever for, what do they call that? Epsom salt bath for all day long so that his skin wouldn't dry out or whatever. Anyway, so she went and stabbed him, and it's because her brother, who, you know, was innocent, he didn't do anything wrong, was killed as a result of being called out by Jean-Paul Marat in The People's Friend. Charlotte Corday herself is executed, but she makes a martyr out of Jean-Paul Marat, who during the French Revolution, people start looking at to Jean-Paul Marat as the guy who sacrificed his life in the name of the revolution, which is, if you're looking at the facts, probably not exactly accurate. But anyhow, it's some of the most famous paintings. I don't know if you know the painter David, okay, of the Romantic period. Jacques Louis David, I think is his full name. He painted that famous painting of Marat in the bathtub, and he's already slain, and his arm is kind of hanging over the edge of the bathtub. It's a very famous painting by David, and he's definitely a painter that you should know from the like neoclassical Romantic era. He's like a neoclassical painter mostly, but anyhow. What else do we need to know about this? Okay, so at the height of the revolution, you see a couple of policies that are really, really radical put into place by this group. Now, remember that the political party that Robespierre and Georges Danton were a part of was known as the Mountain, or the Jacobins. They were a particular part of the Jacobin club called the Mountain. They were the most radical. You also had the Girondists. The Girondins were still radical, but they're more moderate radical than the Mountain. The Mountain want the most sweeping revolutionary changes, including the policy of de-Christianization, which is a major aspect of the Reign of Terror. So they try to completely do away with the Catholic Church in France and establish instead, under Robespierre, the goddess of virtue. So the goddess of virtue, remember that during the neoclassical period, there's a lot of emphasis on ancient Roman ideals like virtue, for example. Remember, virtue was an idea that goes all the way back to the Renaissance and inspired some of the things like the Florentine school. And even down the line, you could say that it was, a part of the like further back in the Roman, like virtue of to have virtue, or like justice or heroism. All right, these are going to be the kinds of traits that are emphasized during the French Revolution, particularly under Robespierre, who is trying to implement an entire society based on the notion of these ancient Roman ideals, of reason, of Republican style government, and so on. Now, of course, he's doing this while directly circumventing people's natural rights of life, liberty, and property and other things like that in the name of like securing safety, okay, which is the number one tool of every single totalitarian leader in history, is use brutal oppression of the people to secure your power, right? True power comes when you allow people to freely operate and you hold your power anyway. So anyhow, Robespierre gets himself into some trouble because he starts going a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs as time goes on. He does some weird things like dresses up in a toga. He changes the Roman Catholic Church calendar to a 10-day French Revolutionary calendar so that people will forget what day Sunday is so that they won't be able to worship anymore. He dismantles various systems in France. And this is all done basically through executive order. But as time goes on, any threat to Robespierre's power, including those of his own friends, starts to become concerning to Robespierre. And this is where we see Georges Danton, who wasn't even allowed to defend himself after being accused of being anti-revolutionary, when Georges Danton suggested that perhaps we could tone down the level of terror a little bit, stop using it so freely to execute people, and this draws suspicion from Robespierre, who then orders the execution of what had been up to this point one of his closest allies during the National Convention days. After that, people in the National Convention start to become increasingly concerned about Robespierre, especially when he comes to the National Convention with a new list that basically says, I have a list of suspects who I believe, like our old friend Georges Danton, could potentially be anti-revolutionary, but I'm not going to tell you who's on this list, and this is the last straw, because at that point, people can only go for so long for being pushed too hard with terror before you start to see a bounce back from that scenario. And the reaction is that the National Convention bites back. And in this scenario, Robespierre is himself accused of, illegal activity and being a threat to the state, and he is jailed and then executed. Now, of course, probably the most notable execution that took place during the Reign of Terror is that of the French king, Louis XVI, as well as down the line, a little bit later, his wife or widow, Marie Antoinette. His son, also named Louis, died in jail, and this happened pretty early on in the days of the National Convention. This was in January of 1793 that the king was executed. And then 1793, 1794 is when things really start getting crazy in France with all the executions. Meanwhile, keep in mind, they're still fighting a foreign war. Now, they are fighting it more successfully under the National Convention. They actually do have some success against their foreign enemies at this time. There was, I forgot to tell you that the thing that really people lost faith in the king's ability of leadership was the flight to Varenne. That was when the king tried to escape in the midst of the night during the Legislative Assembly days, back before Robespierre came to power in the National Convention. But that flight to Varenne was really the nail in the coffin of people's confidence in Louis XVI's leadership as king, and it made the execution of the king a little bit more palatable to the most radical members of the National Convention, because they viewed him as a traitor. So after Robespierre gets executed, this is where we see the French Revolution enter into a brand new phase. And this is now the end of the National Convention and the transfer of power to yet again a brand new system of government, this time called the Directory. So just for review purposes, we start off with the ancient regime, absolutism, okay, which is what we've had in France all up to this point in review. Then we see the Estates General called, and that's where they throw off the ancient regime titles and take on the title of National Assembly. The National Assembly was meant to be a provisional temporary government it establishes the Legislative Assembly. The Legislative Assembly gets dismantled as threats mount and chaos mounts in Paris with the September massacres in 1792. And that's where we see the establishment of the National Convention. So the National Convention is the Reign of Terror days under Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobin Club. And then when the Reign of Terror is over, we see the National Convention is dissolved and the Directory is established. The Directory lasts from 1794-95, depending on when you're counting the start date of it, to or what you're using to qualify the start of the Directory. Are you using the end of Robespierre, or are you using the establishment of their first meeting? Are you using whatever? So 1794-95 is when the Directory gets established. It is the government that it starts to become more conservative. So we're now past the most radical phase, and we're seeing it swing back to becoming a little bit more conservative. One of the things that they did in the Directory days is that they split power. Instead of having a single executive branch leader, like we have the president, who is a single leader, he doesn't split his powers, his executive powers, with anyone. But they had a 5-man, what they called Directory, so a 5-man executive branch, basically, where power was split between 5 people, so that you wouldn't get yourself into another Robespierre type situation where authority all rests with one person, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. So someone said once. It was a British prime minister or member of parliament who said that. Forget his name. Anyway, so the Directory lasts for a while, but the Directory had its own problems, to be honest with you. The Directory is maybe a little bit corrupt. You see some nepotism and some favoritism in the Directory that don't really benefit the main bourgeois class so much. The bourgeoisie and the peasants, the former Third Estate, don't benefit as much from the Directory as they were hoping to. It's somewhat apologetic to the old First and Second Estates, the Directory is. And so the Directory, varying degrees of success as the years go on with the Directory. It is a little more stable, if nothing else. It's not as radical. We don't see like people's heads being chopped off like we used to during the Reign of Terror days. So that's a good thing. But frankly, it's got some problems with it. Now, it's at this time that we see a young artillery general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, who has been a pro-revolutionary figure in the French military to this point, but a young man up to this point. And he really makes a name for himself for the first time by defending the Directory against a noble insurrection in the early days of it in 1795. I think it's October of 1795. There's a attempted noble overthrow of the Directory, and Napoleon famously repels this threat against the government, and he is put into a position afterwards by the powers that be to go and fight on behalf of the French foreign forces to conquer various places. So this is where Napoleon goes on his expeditions through Europe and into North Africa, and he is highly successful. He has a huge army who is loyal to him, and over the next 4 years, 1795, 96, 97, 98, he is highly successful in his foreign expeditions. He gets pinned down by the British Royal Navy after the Battle of the Nile in 1797. But aside from that, and not really allowing that news to return back to France, he's highly successful in his conquering of, say, Austria, and he goes throughout the Swiss Alps and stuff like that, and the Austrian Alps, and then all the way down into North Africa, and then returns to France, and he comes back to France a national hero, because everybody hears about all these military successes that France is having under this young upstart artillery general, Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon comes back, he realizes that the directory that he defended years ago is not the same directory that it was before, and it's viewed by the French as a weak government that is prone to corruption and not really resolving the problems that France is still having economically and with bread shortages and so on. Because remember, we're really talking about, it's only been 6 years. And economies, if you look at the Great Depression, for example, Great Depression starts in 1929. We don't pull out of it for 1929. We don't pull out of it for about 14 years, 13, 14 years. It's really not until World War II that we are able to kind of pull ourselves out of the Great Depression. It's a long time. Economies are kind of like ocean barges. They're really, once they're moving in a certain direction, it takes a lot of force to change the direction the opposite way. So France, it's not like France's problems are just magically resolved. Not to mention they just got done killing, thousands of their own people. Plus they're still fighting a war. France is still facing a number of different problems under the Directory. And when Napoleon comes back, these problems aren't resolved. And Napoleon says, well, we need somebody who can resolve these problems. And that's when he is urged by people, even some people within the Directory, to do his coup d'etat Brumaire, which was Brumaire was the month of basically November in the French Revolutionary calendar, which they were still using at that time. So the coup d'etat Brumaire, and that is where Napoleon overthrows the Directory and establishes what's known now as the First Consulate, which is the early years of Napoleon's reign. And it's at this time that he's taking the title of First Consul of France. He is considered an enlightened despotic type figure. He doesn't take the title, he doesn't take the title of emperor until 1804, when he crowns himself emperor at Notre Dame Cathedral, which famously caught on fire a year or so ago. And he starts to do some other things. Napoleon does. He puts into place the Napoleonic Code, which systematizes the civil laws of France, the civil and criminal codes of France. Remember that some of the changes that Napoleon makes, he keeps some changes of the revolution, but not all of them. Napoleon is all about restrained freedom. Okay, so you can say certain things, but you can't say anything that you want. Newspapers get censored at this time, for example. So you can't, there is still censorship. He establishes these things called lyces, or Lyceum, is the French or the Latin term. A Lyceum is like a public training session, I guess you would call it. And these lyces in France were meant to be training sessions for public servants, so that when you went and served in capacity as a certain position in government in France, that you would know what you were doing and you wouldn't screw it up. It was try to cut down on corruption mostly, and then so people had to be qualified. You had to have some sort of merit to be able to hold a government position. Also, he restructures the French military. So remember that one of the reasons that Napoleon is so successful in overthrowing the government during the coup d'état is because he comes back with a military that is hugely loyal to him, and him personally as a man, and as their military commander. And so he restructures the military so that nobles aren't the only ones that can serve in capacity as officers anymore. It used to be back in the ancient regime days that the only way you could be an officer is if you were a noble. But instead, what Napoleon does, he starts promoting people based on service and on merit. So you see a more meritocracy type system develop in the French military at this time, where if you distinguish yourself on the battlefield as a skilled leader or as a skilled commander, then you're going to rise the ranks faster, and potentially, end up having a more powerful position within the military or down the line in the government. Some other changes that Napoleon makes: he invites back the church. So there's something called the Concordat of 1801. The Concordat of 1801 was when Napoleon basically apologizes on behalf of the French revolutionary forces before him on being a little bit too anti-clerical, and says that the church in France is important, the Catholic Church in France is important, and invites the Pope back. But he does not allow the Pope to crown him, because symbolically that would mean that he was subduing himself to the Pope. So instead of allowing the Pope to crown him emperor in 1804, he takes the crown from the Pope's hands and puts it on his own head, symbolizing that no one can crown Napoleon except for Napoleon. Now, of course, Napoleon continues fighting battles at this time. He's still waging war against, in particular, the British. So the Napoleonic Wars are going on at this time. There are some other important things about Napoleon that we need to understand. He sold off the Louisiana territory to Thomas Jefferson, who at that time was the third president of the United States. Napoleon had, for a brief time, tried to reestablish colonial slavery in Haiti, which at the time was known as Saint-Domingue. This fails miserably, and there's a massive slave revolt led by Toussaint Louverture in Haiti at that time, and it's a successful revolution, and they get rid of French colonial rule in Haiti once and for all. This was known as the Haitian Revolution. It's probably in many ways more revolutionary than either the French or American Revolution were. Because you have actually a colonial slave society that completely overthrows the colonial power there, not just like a in name only overthrow of government. So Napoleon gives up any future ambitions to taking over the New World, okay, or his ambitions in North America. Basically, he lets those go by the wayside, and instead he focuses on trying to take over all of Europe, which he is pretty successful at doing, with the exception of a handful of places. Portugal being one of them, Russia being another, and then Britain being a third. So those three places serve as kind of thorns in Napoleon's side. Less so Portugal, more so the fact that he just couldn't get through Spain to take Portugal. It's not that the Portuguese themselves were a threat to Napoleon. It's the fact that Napoleon's insatiable thirst to take over everywhere in Europe results in him invading Spain. And this is called the Peninsular War, which was one of three major mistakes that Napoleon made as he was trying to take over Europe. And so one of the major mistakes that he makes is that he gets the Napoleonic French forces involved in the Peninsular War, where he was fighting against both the Spanish and the British, who were trying to support the Spanish. Remember that Napoleon had taken and put his brother Joseph Bonaparte as the king of Spain at that time, which the Spanish people didn't like. And so this is where we see the Spanish using guerrilla-style warfare techniques to fight against the French, which they were not used to fighting against. They lose a tremendous number of men, hundreds of thousands of men in the Peninsular War. Another major mistake that Napoleon made at this time was something called the Continental System. So in 1805, there was a famous naval battle that the French lost against the British called the Battle of Trafalgar. And the Battle of Trafalgar resulted in the famous Vice Admiral of the British Royal Navy, Horatio Nelson, being assassinated, shot by a French sniper. However, it was nonetheless still a loss for the French Navy under Admiral Villeneuve, was the guy's name. And this was an important loss because it meant that the French Navy was not going to be able to take the British Navy on directly anymore. it resulted in it. They would be able to take them on directly in battles and stuff, but the Battle of Trafalgar solidifies British naval superiority. And because the French don't have a superior naval force, if the British, when push comes to shove, if the British need to defend themselves from a French invasion, the only way you can get to Britain at this time, because planes don't exist and stuff, is by sailing there. Okay, Britain is an island. And so the French have to take their ships over to Britain in order to try to take Britain. If you can't get past the British Navy, you can't get to Britain. And so Britain has a major advantage that that their navy establishes dominance over the French navy. So instead what the French say is, well, we'll go on the defensive with our navy and we'll try and establish what's known as the Continental System. We will starve out Britain from European trade. There were some problems with this idea, though. Number one, the British have stuff that the rest of the world wants to trade, because the British, amongst other things, like their navy, have a vast array of colonial assets around the world. Remember, it was not for no reason. In other words, there was a reason that they called the British the empire upon which the sun never set. And it's because the British had colonies everywhere around the planet that they extracted goods from daily. And so the British have all sorts of items that Europeans have high demand for. And you know, whether it's tea or coffee or cocoa or tobacco or cotton or whatever, there's a number of different things that the British have that the rest of Europe wants to trade. So blocking European trade from the British is kind of like blocking European trade from something that they want. And that's not going to work out so well. Now, in particular, one nation who really liked trading with Britain was Russia. And the leader of Russia at this time is Tsar Alexander I. Tsar Alexander I is friends with Napoleon for a while, but then Napoleon and him have a falling out, I think having something to do with his sister, but then also having something to do with Alexander I's sister, or maybe cousin or aunt or someone. I forget. There's a lady involved. I remember that. Anyhow, the British and the Russians had been trading for a while, and when the Continental System gets established, the idea is, well, we will use our ships, the French will use their ships to block British ships from being able to enter into ports, which is successful in some areas until they realize, wait a second, the British ships are stronger than ours. So the British ships continue trading into Europe, in particular with Russia, who previously Tsar Alexander I had promised Napoleon to stop trading with the British. But he starts trading with the British again anyway, because the British, frankly, just have a lot of goods that the Russians wanted. And so, plus remember that the British have access up through the North Sea and the Baltic Sea with relative ease. So British ships, it's not too far away for the British ships to trade with Russia, who is a lucrative trading partner. So anyhow, moving on to the third major mistake. So the Continental System, major mistake because, you know, the British blockade was actually counter-blockaded against the French, and their blockade was more successful, and this actually ended up hurting France economically more than it ended up hurting Britain economically. So the British counter-blockade is one of the reasons that this doesn't work out for them. Then finally, the third major mistake, and the last thing that I'll be talking about in today's review of the French Revolution and Napoleonic era, is the invasion of Russia. So in 1812, Napoleon decides to gather forces after now this falling out between Napoleon Tsar Alexander I is complete. Napoleon sets his sights on taking over Russia. He invades Russia. He does so with his grand army of considerable amount of men. I forget exactly the number, but a huge number of men. And they march into Russia in the summertime, and they are fighting against the Russians. But the Russians are using this tactic called scorched earth policy, which actually would be used by the Russians again in World War II against the German invasion. But the scorched earth policy is basically Alexander I would order his troops to retreat to lure the French troops further and further and further into the interior of Russia. And of course, the further into the interior of Russia that you go, the farther and farther away from France you are, and the more time it's going to take for you to march back. And so as time goes on, they are marching further into Russia with all these men, but the Russians are burning down their own lands as they do so, until finally they do meet in battle just outside of Moscow at a battle called the Battle of Borodino. And the Battle of Borodino results in a French victory, ostensibly. The Russians do retreat into Moscow, but as they retreat into Moscow, and the French forces once again get lured further and further in, as the French forces under Napoleon enter into Moscow, they realize that the entire city has been set ablaze. And that's because, once again, Alexander I would rather burn down his own territory than to allow it to fall into the hands of the French and in any way assist them. And the reason that they're burning down their lands is because they're trying to make it so that the French can't use their lands to resupply their troops, right, with food and other things like that. So they burn the lands down, they kill the livestock so that the French can't use the resources to refit their troops. Now, when they get into Moscow and it's burning, this is about September of 1812. Napoleon sticks around for about a month or so to try to gain order of the situation. It does not happen. And eventually it's like, look, the whole city's ablaze. We're facing attacks on a daily basis from people on the outskirts, these Russian raider troops on the outskirts of the city of Moscow. Let's just go home. We're done. We learned our lesson here. We just got to go home and get this over with. We proved we were militarily superior, but we're not going to be able to hold on to this. But now it's October, and the ground has frozen. All the lands that they burned down are still burned down. It's not like, that just magically fixes itself, especially not as you're heading into the wintertime. And so now they're marching back, but the weather's turned, and they're marching back, and it's cold. So now it's not going to be May, June, July, August, September. They're marching now back in October, November, December, January, and that is going to be really, really bad for the French. It's going to result in tremendous casualties to disease, to starvation, to the elements because of all sorts of things. And then too, being attacked from behind as they are retreating now. Now, Napoleon does make it back to France, but not without some other issues. There's a famous battle called the Battle of Leap Zig, which results in a French loss. And then he has to get back to Paris, and then he defends once more at Paris, and then his generals lose faith in him. And this is where Napoleon is exiled to the city of Elba after his defeat. And that was in 1813. And then he is gone for a while. He's gone for about a year. But he's famous. He's like the most famous military commander in all of history, other than Alexander the Great, maybe. And so, people know who Napoleon is. He makes friends with people in Elba. Elba's in the Mediterranean. He escapes back to France. This is a period of time known as the 100 Days, if you recall the 100 Days. And the 100 Days is a period of time for about 3 months where Napoleon is welcomed back, because for a period of time they had put Louis XVI's younger brother, Louis XVIII, back on the throne. So the Bourbon monarch goes back on the throne while Napoleon is down in Elba. People hated that, and they kind of started to remember the good old days under the glory of Napoleon. And so when the emperor returns, he recrowns himself emperor. The French government is once again overthrown. And then and he starts collecting forces to have another battle. And this would be the nail in the coffin for Napoleon, called the Battle of Waterloo. And this happens in 1815. The Battle of Waterloo does not go very well for Napoleon. It is a battle that starts off against just the British, but then the Prussians come and reinforced after 2 straight days of battle. Napoleon can't get on his horse for this battle because he has a terrible case of what are called hemorrhoids. So he has a difficult time leading his troops. The battle is postponed longer than he wanted to because there was a terrible, terrible torrential thunderstorm the night before the battle was supposed to take place. So the field was completely soaked, and he has to wait for it to dry, so his horses couldn't get out fast enough. The whole thing really goes awry. And when those Prussian forces come in to support the British, they fight for a little while longer, and after a while, Napoleon's forces give way. And that was the last time that Napoleon fights a battle in Europe, and the last time that really Napoleon is in Europe. He gets exiled thereafter to St. Helena in the South Atlantic off the coast of Africa, and he dies there 6 years later from probably stomach cancer. So that gives you a review of the major events of the French Revolution and Napoleonic era. I went on today for about an hour and 40 minutes. That's one of the longer ones that I've done here, but I figured that I would take some time to really go into the specifics of some of these things with you. I hope that you found this informative. I will be putting up the distance assignment for today by about noon. I have to sign off here and get my stuff ready to go for regular world history, which I'll be lecturing about World War II. So thank you so much for those 10 of you who are watching right now. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to send me a message on Schoology or put a comment in the updates section on Schoology, and I'll see it and respond to it. All right, folks, thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.